Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. We are here today for one more session of the Slaveryarchive book club. And today we have Verena Krebs who will be presenting the book that you see here. I hope, okay, perhaps you cannot see the cover because I have the background. Medieval Ethiopian Kingship, Craft and Diplomacy with Latin Europe. And this was published this year, 2021, with Palgrave, MacMillan. I will quickly introduce Verena and then she will start presenting. After that, we will have questions and answers. Verena Krebs is Junior Professor for Medieval Cultural Realms and Their Entanglements in the Department of History at Ruhr University, Bochum, Germany, where she is also the director of the Bochum Center for Mediterranean Studies. She holds a binational PhD from the Universities of Constance, Germany, and also Mekelle in Ethiopia. Her primary research focuses on the late medieval Solomonic Kingdom of Ethiopia and its connections to the wider Mediterranean region. Then Dr. Krebs will be presenting for about 10, 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And then those of you, if you have questions, you can put the questions either in the chat if you are on Zoom. Also, you can raise your hand by clicking at the bottom of your screen on reactions, and you'll be able to speak on video. And you are currently live on YouTube. Then if you are asking questions on audio or video, you'll be on YouTube as well. For those who are watching only on YouTube, you can leave your questions in the chat and you are going to make our possible to answer. Welcome, Verena, and we are looking forward to this presentation.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for bearing with my technical difficulties that we've had. So the presentation is being shared by somebody else kindly enough now, and I hope it will work. So it's a great honor and a bit scary, of course, to speak about this book to you, because it has taken up 12 years of my life, from my master's to basically when I first started as a professor here in Bochum. It is the first of two books that looks at how kingship, rule and legitimacy, and thus power and material culture interacted in Solomonic Christian Ethiopia between the very early 15th century and the 1530s. Vanessa, could you please click? Just to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So my sincere hope is that this book offers a new way of looking at Ethiopian Christian history from the 15th to the 16th century. And so what the book does is closely look at one specific aspect and a moment in Ethiopian history, namely when a good dozen embassies were sent out. Another click, please. And a click. And a click. From Solomonic Ethiopia, here in the highlands of the Horn of Africa, to Latin Europe. The book uses this long-distance diplomacy to draw out what we can learn about local Ethiopian history, and specifically what we can learn about kingship, how these kings saw themselves and their place in the world. The first three chapters offer a rereading of the source material, and often this source material on which I'm basing my findings has been known for very many decades, because many of the sources on this case of intercontinental diplomacy were actually preserved in European archives. Some sources, crucially about the 1420s, have come to light much more recently, and they really put a very different spin on things. Could you click again? Thank you. So to paint a very broad picture, over the course of 120 years, successive Ethiopian kings and embassies and Ethiopian ambassadors appear in very different places in the Latin Christian Mediterranean and in Europe. Depending on how we count, the number varies, but it's at the very least 12 missions throughout the 15th century. And Solomonic ambassadors, pilgrims, and sometimes pilgrims acting as ambassadors turn up far beyond the Mediterranean. They're in Santiago de Compostela on the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula and on Lake Constance in modern-day Germany, where incidentally I was doing my PhD thesis many, many years later. So continued and lasting contacts between distant medieval royal courts are far from surprising. And as art historian Finbar Flood has rightly pointed out, people and things have been mixed up for a very long time. They don't conform to the boundaries imposed upon them by modern anthropologists and historians. But in this specific case, as you can see in this map, people and things had to travel thousands of miles to mix up between Ethiopia and the Latin West. They needed to cross several mountain ranges, deserts, and 2 large bodies of water. And even at the best of times, any such journey would take at least half a year. Another click, please. Yet if we look at the sources, nearly all rulers in regions of the 15th and early 16th century sent out envoys to Latin Europe in some way, which leads to the question at the heart of the book. Why? Why did generations of Ethiopian kings send out their emissaries, and why did they initiate contacts time and time again? Because they were clearly the initiators. Sadly, there are no actual letters written by Ethiopian kings that have come down to us for the first 100 years of contacts. But there's a whole wealth of other text that has been preserved. There's administrative notes, there's copies of official letters, there's treasury records, there's city annals, chronicles, itineraries, diary entries, you get the picture. And all of these sources were written mostly in languages of like medieval Europe, so in Latin, Italian, French, German, Catalan, Portuguese, and much more Latin. Of course, there's also documents from Ethiopia itself, written in Ge'ez, the ancient literary and liturgical language of the Christian kingdom, which, well, the Christian church at least dates back to the 4th century in the Ethiopian Eritrean highlands. And lastly, but not least, we also have Arabic records from Mamluk Egypt, Ethiopia's northern neighbor, and of course, like a major threshold point between the Mediterranean and the Horn of Africa. Another click, please. So all of these sources allow us to catch a glimpse of the Ethiopian agency and what was driving Ethiopian kings to send out ambassadors on this long and arduous route time and time again. So what the first few chapters, as I've said, does is offer a chronological rereading and re-evaluation of the source material. And I've been trying to strip away Latin Christian hopes or imaginings or Latin Christian knowledge about Ethiopia because I'm profoundly uninterested in contributing more to a literature about how Europeans thought about Africans without having any actual knowledge, right? And I've been trying to also evaluate what in Mamluk Egyptian sources, for example, might be paranoia and, complicated political, let's say, suspicions instead of just, bare bone facts. What became apparent in my research was that if we boil it down to the smallest common denominator, we see some specific golden threads that run through every single embassy time and time again. There's a very palpable Ethiopian interest in relics, in foreign Christian religious martyrial culture. So in fine embroidered fabrics with religious images, ideally in liturgical objects, in relics, of course, again. So everything kingly, prestigious, and Christian. And you see it here in the list of demands issued by King Dawit, who sent his first embassy that arrived in Venice in 1402. His son Yeshak sent another embassy 20 years later that also requested very similar things. And his Yeshak's brother, also Dawit's son, once again had, at least very, very similar demands. So beyond these precious objects, precious religious objects that were clearly a big interest here, was the interest in the acquisition of builders, stonemasons, painters, carpenters, gold and silversmiths, and thus artisans and craftsmen that are skilled in trades necessary to construct things. Could you click again, please? So I've just boiled it down here. And as I said, like many golden threads, these interests are palpable in nearly every embassy. And crucially, these findings, and this is why it took me such a long time to write this book, are at a very stark contrast of what decades of earlier research has suggested for the 20th century, throughout the 20th century. Another click, please. So in a major article published shortly after the fascist Italian forces were once again expelled from the Ethiopian highlands in the 1940s, an Italian historian by the name of Renato Lefebvre opined that the Ethiopian kings had first approached medieval Italy out of a quote unquote need for its artistically and technologically superior workforce. Even in 1402, Lefebvre said, such demands were caused by and I quote here, lack of skilled local African labor. And he followed then that Ethiopia had always needed Italian ingenuity and skill. It seems apparent how much such ideas speak more to Lefebvre's present political moment in the 1940s than to the 15th century. Yet 2 decades later, the same man, you see it in the quote up here, stated somewhat less bluntly that Solomonic rulers must have sent out their missions to obtain masters of art and industry, how he then called it, to, quote, raise the civical and technical level of the Ethiopian kingdom. They were, according to him, driven by a need to enhance their military and their militarily efficiency. And it's impossible not to see the long shadow and direct through line of colonialist thought underlying such assumptions here. Yet in a groundbreaking work, the great medieval Ethiopian historian, Tadesse Tamrat, followed Lefebvre's interpretation because he was writing only years later, and this was what had been around in research at the time. So he too assumed that the delegation's purposes had been to ask for artists and technologists and military experts to access European technology. Another click, please. Yes. It is very hard to overstate how both scholars have impacted the field between now and then. So scholarship has had largely and uniformly asserted that all Solomonic missions to Europe were tied to this desire for craftsmen technologists and a need for quote unquote European technology and arms and even military alliances. But when I was reading the sources, this was simply not what I found. These ostensible Ethiopian interests and desires were absent in the sources for the first 100 years of contacts. And even in the 16th century, in a much changed political climate in the Horn of Africa, when guns and ideas about military alliances do appear in some select letters of Ethiopian King Lipnadingle, they also only once again reappeared alongside the request for relics, for precious religious wares, for fine fabrics, for liturgical items, and again, alongside a wish for, first of all, building-related craftspeople. Lipnadingle in the 16th century also wanted primarily painters, bricklayers, stonemasons, carpenters, and gold and silversmiths. In one document from 1520, Atze Lipnadingle himself even clearly stated that his very first request from Portugal was for roofers and giant curtains because he wanted to improve the roof of a church that he had recently built and hang curtains similar to ones that he already possessed with European iconography in these same churches. And that's the key here, I think. And that's what I present in the last chapter of the book. One more click, please. So the Solomonic Ethiopian interest in relics, precious religious material culture, and liturgical objects, and builders and ornamenters and painters, that red thread that I found fits very, very well into the local history of Ethiopia at the time. In the latter half of the 14th century, the Solomonic Christian kings had consolidated their power over most of the central plateau that you see here. And they had ushered in substantial religious reforms that caused the flourishing of religious literature. But from the early 15th century onwards, we also find a period of monumental building activity in the central Ethiopian highland plateau. Dozens of royal prestigious churches and monasteries were being built by the same kings that were sending their embassies, requesting religious wares and building related labor. These royal churches were material testament to the Solomonic king's supreme political claim of power and a physical assertion of each sovereign's rightful and just Christian rulership. And of course, such prestigious religious centers needed to be built, ornamented, endowed, and furnished with all the things worthy of being built by the kings of the Solomonic line. And the Solomonic kings, incidentally, propagated themselves as the only true genealogical and spiritual heirs of the biblical kings David and Solomon in their foundational myth, the Kibra Negast. Therefore, the last chapter of the book argues that we need to read the concurrent diplomatic relations between Ethiopia and the Latin West against this backdrop of monumental royal building activity. We need to read it against the process of local state building, and diplomacy becomes a side effect of something that is going on in the Ethiopian highlands. Another click, please. And I'm coming to a close. So in the last pages of the book, I argue that this Solomonic state building activity triggered the embassies to foreign Christian parts of the world, to the distant exotic parts of Frankland. This is a pattern found in very many pre-modern societies, of course. A king obtaining things from very far away shows first and foremost his own vast geographical reach and power to his own people. But in this specific case, there's even a more interestingly Ethiopian Solomonic aspect here. Just as I said, the Ethiopian Solomonic kings propagated themselves as the true heirs of the biblical kings David and Solomon through Solomon's Ethiopian son with the Queen of Sheba. And according to the Kibra Negast, that made these kings the first of all Christian kings in the world, and their kingdom the new chosen kingdom of God. In this society, to this dynasty, the very process of approaching a foreign king to ask for artisans and builders would have emulated actions ascribed to the biblical King Solomon, for example, in the Book of Chronicles, but also in other parts of the Bible, who is narrated again and again as sending an embassy to a sovereign foreign king, asking him for a master craftsman. That is not because there was a lack of skill in Jerusalem. Instead, Solomon wants this foreign craftsman to come and work with his own master craftsmen in Jerusalem because they are trying to tackle the impossible, build the most perfect temple for God. So what I tried to show in the book really was that these parallels must have been readily apparent, not just to the Ethiopian kings, because this was how they defined their kingship, but also even to their people. And it seems that they were even apparent to the foreign kings in Europe, to whom stories of this Solomonic descent and that the Solomonic kings had the Ark of the Covenant had been told. We find this in the European sources. And that, again, I think, gives us a view on how these Ethiopian kings, how these Solomonic kings understood themselves and their place in the world, namely as the first Christian kings in all the kingdoms of men, building magnificent churches instead of temples to assert their divinely sanctioned power. Yeah, and what this lastly does, I think, is not just revise our ideas about Solomonic Ethiopian kingship and Ethiopian European encounters in this period, but I think it also in general sheds new and rather different light onto African European encounters in a time that is still often narrated only as a European age of exploration. And one more click. Lastly, I hope that it gives us a new framework for seeing and understanding material culture of this kingdom at that same time, because here we have long found imported and even specifically commissioned religious objects from startlingly faraway places, from Crete, from Flanders, from Germany, from France, that were in Ethiopian royal hands in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. So historians and art historians have struggled to make sense of these objects, but against the framework of the book, I hope, such things become much less puzzling. They become just one more aspect of an Ethiopian Christian kingdom looking both outwards and inwards in the late Middle Ages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Verena. This was a great presentation then that gives us a great overview of the book. And now we are ready for the questions. Then if you have questions, you can raise your hand by clicking on reactions at the bottom of your screen. And if not, you can always, if you don't have a video or audio, you can put the questions in the chat and we can read out loud. Who will be the first and we see several Africanists who are around as well, then let's start. Okay, I will start then with a question to Verena. My question would be the following, because of course that this is a topic that many of us we are very far from being specialists, and for many it's the first time that they are seeing this and reading this kind of work. My question for you would be, to which extent in the period that you are looking at, the case of these diplomatic relations with exchanges of gifts, then to which extent the case of Ethiopia during this period is exceptional? And if this has to do with Christianity, or if we can make here claims, and if you would be able to connect the case of Ethiopia to other African kingdoms during the same period that were also engaging in similar kinds of exchanges. Of course, when you are referring to material culture, and I see especially the last slide that you showed, then you see these artworks, and also artworks, more exotic objects that came sometimes from Europe and other distant regions. When you are referring to material culture, there were also other small things and things that perhaps were not, they did not even survive, but other things that are considered less exotic, less precious, but were still, these exchanges were still going on. And my question would be the following: whether or not the case of Ethiopia here in the period that you are looking at is exceptional, and whether or not the fact these exchanges are due to the kingdom embracing Christianity, or in cases where Christianity was not embraced, then if similar exchanges were taking place, and if this is somewhat comparable to the case that you examine in the book.
That's a very good question. I mean, of course, other, especially art historians, have worked on similar encounters. So Cécile Fromont has looked at Portuguese connections and encounters, and also gifts being exchanged between Congo and Portugal. But about your question about whether this is exceptional, I think yes and no, and it's a bit complicated because it depends on the way European rulers at the time understood Ethiopia. And they were, and I must stress this, operating under very little knowledge and a lot of mythical assumed knowledge. So in Europe, Ethiopia, or this Christian kingdom that people in Europe had become aware of as being located to the south of Egypt, that from the early 14th century had been imagined as the realm of Prester John. And in the European imagination for the past 200 years, people had imagined Prester John as being the strongest, wealthiest, most militarily powerful Christian king in the world, who was a priest and a king. And there's this very elaborate myth that is based on a hoax, but that doesn't make it any less real to European contemporaries in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. So when the first Ethiopian ambassadors arrive, they are interpreted as the ambassadors of Prester John, which then acts as like a smokescreen, or like a, I don't know, they are assumed to not just be the ambassadors of this de facto militarily powerful Christian kingdom in the Horn of Africa, but all of the mythical baggage that the term Prester John and his kingdom brings with it. And I think that explains the way European kings, and also the Pope, for example, encountered Ethiopia. because we have instances where, of course, European powers were very interested, for example, in military alliances with the Ethiopians or with the Ethiopian Christians, because they assumed Prester John would be this Christian king who would sweep in and save them from the Ottomans. And of course, the Latin papacy was also quite ecstatic and at the same time wanted the Ethiopians to accept Latin Christian supremacy or adhere, unify with the Latin Christian Church. And the Ethiopian Christian rulers, so particularly Zara Jacob, didn't quite care, didn't reply, because this was of no relevance to the Ethiopian Christian kings and Ethiopian Christianity. So it's a very uneven encounter in the sense that here, the African Christian kingdom has all of the power also even handed to them by their European counterpart, because basically European kings, like even Alfonso V of Aragon, in their mind, they're trying to enter into contact with, like, I don't know, somebody who's like Batman and Superman combined. So that from the very onset, I think, changes the power relation. And that I think that is also considerably different than to how Portuguese encounters with rulers in West Africa happened, because here you have these African Christian kings reaching out and being assumed to be from the outset the most powerful militarily and wealthiest kings in the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I believe that you have a question in the chat from Catherine Colling. Catherine, do you want to ask the question on video or audio, or do you want me to read?
Oh, yeah, I can ask.
Okay, please.
And actually, you kind of started talking about this. I was really curious what the response would have been from the Latin Church hierarchy, early, I guess, at any level, to this idea that these Solomonic kings are the true inheritors of this Davidic and Solomonic line, and that they're building this perfect Christian state, or at least that they're building a sort of the true Christian state. And if there was, along with that, any reluctance then to respond to any of these requests for relics or other materials or artisans. I'm just kind of wondering what there is sort of in the evidence and historical data that we have about that.
So once again, I think also the geographical distance, but also who had the ability to obtain knowledge and to actually travel from one way to the other. So we have throughout the 15th century, Ethiopian ambassadors making their way to Europe. We do not have a single successful European embassy doing the same. There's many embassies that get sent out from different Latin Christian courts, and they all fail or nobody ever comes back. So that, I think, leaves many things sort of unclear, because I don't know, if the ambassadors that you send out from Aragon or from the papacy never make it there, then you also have no additional knowledge in Aragon or in Rome. So I think this line that, for example, Alfonso V of Aragon greets the Ethiopian King Yeshak in saying, greetings to my best and most beloved brother, King Yeshak, who is, and then comes a whole host of titles, and included in that is keeper of the tablets of Mount Zion, so the Ark of the Covenant, and of the throne of David. So, and Alfonso V doesn't seem to find that problematic at all. He is completely ecstatic. He is hoping to enter into a marriage alliance with the Ethiopian dynasty or with the Solomonic dynasty. And we have several documents where we see his continued hope that such a marriage alliance would materialize. So make of that what you will. The Latin papacy, I mean, so much gets lost in translation. And when the Pope in Rome tries to put the pressure on, we also notice that Ethiopian kings just stop responding. And because as I said, European powers are so very bad in actually sending missions to Ethiopia because they all fail, then just nothing happens.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Nobody has, I don't see any hands here. Let's see if you have from the chat, then feel free to start if you want. Okay, nobody showing up.
Then I can ask a question.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yes, hi, Verena. Thank you for this book, this wonderful presentation. And I am very far afield from your research, so I apologize. But one of the things that struck me as I'm reading the book and listening to you is the sort of like idea of a teleology of Europe is kind of taken for granted, but a teleology of Africa is not. So that the Christian kingdom of Solomon is sort of a separate construct than the idea of European kingdoms. But it doesn't even, just my intuition tells me that that there might be a little bit of ray of light that we can turn back to see kind of an even more fluid relationship between some kind of diplomacy to Europe that can be singled out, and maybe perhaps something that you've encountered that you can speak more about is a sort of like multi-directional diplomacy effort during this to build these local efforts that is also pointing perhaps to Timbuktu, to the other to West Africa, and I don't know if you want to South Asia, Malabar, etc. So I was just wondering if you felt that ever the need to destabilize a little bit, sort of like kind of like the quintessential European African relationship.
I mean, I'm a medievalist who sort of stumbled into this the last decade and a half. And I do not necessarily identify as a historian of Africa, but of course, I think it's readily apparent how much I think also the historiography and the assumed knowledge, right, that was there, that was out there, and that had also morphed into this, like, really assumed fact that had entered important encyclopedias and everything. How much that really is simply based on the assumptions that somebody in Italy who, was possibly quite upset that yet another attempt at colonialization failed, was putting into words, and how that trickles down. And eventually, if you don't follow it back from where this thought originated, it sort of, I keep saying it gets watered down. And I think that is really the most problematic thing, that like when Renato Lefebvre says something that is obviously racist and colonialist in the 1940s, that springs out at you. But when it has become like in an encyclopedia article, just sort of like Ethiopian rulers were interested in arms, full stop. And I think that just I can't really speak. I can only speak to my own process of trying to make sense of this. But it took me 4 attempts actually to write this book, because I felt rather absurd and foolish and scared. Because you're a grad student and you're like, this doesn't really match what everybody else seems to believe. And I could say that I thought it was nonsense, but I couldn't offer up a better interpretation for why these embassies were being sent, if not for arms and if not for military alliances. And that only came once actually the state of research on internal Ethiopian history got much better, because there have been leaps and bounds in the historiography on pre-modern Ethiopia in recent years. And that has helped then, of course, make sense in a way of these things that people had known for much longer and had also obsessively focused on for, as I said, again, very Italian colonialist reasons. So I think that's probably not really answering your question, but maybe showing like how in this case it played out for me. You're
Thank
muted.
you. You're muted.
After 2 years, still muted. In that historiography, is there work being done on what we would call today South to South, for lack of a better word? Do we see a lot of evidence coming out that says that these kings were also reaching out horizontally, or maybe even to the south of their kingdom?
I mean, this is one thing that I think this is where the historiography hasn't gotten much better. So we know nearly nothing. And this is something that at congresses, people keep saying, like, there's these Nubian Christian kingdoms that are more or less coeval. And nobody's really worked on Nubian-Ethiopian relationship, political, cultural, what have you. As you mentioned, the Malabar coast, so there's Christian communities there. There's, of course, the Copts in Egypt. So all of this, like, from the lens of cultural and social historians, is like it's still in a very, very early, like, nascent stage. So I keep being asked whether and why Latin Europe, and I don't quite know. I think it might have something to do with reaching out to sovereign Christian kingdoms, so reaching out to an equal, right? And in the 15th century, and especially in the early 16th century, if you want to reach out from the Horn of Africa to another sovereign Christian kingdom, you need to go basically to the Latin Mediterranean, and you need to go there because Byzantium is considerably weaker, and like most of the Eastern Christianities are living under different rule. So that might be one aspect, but it could also be because just more European historians have worked on the European archival material, and that sort of skews our sample. So.
Yeah, and what survives itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Verena. We have another question coming from Dalila de Souza. Then, hello, Dalila. I am spotlighting you.
Boa tarde. Thank you for taking my question. Dr. Verena, I'm Dalila de Souza. I am historian, just retired from Spelman College in Atlanta. But I grew up both in Mozambique, where I was born, as well as in Portugal, at a time when there was what we thought later as a fascist dictatorship. And from the very beginning in our history classes, the central justification, the central rationale that children in school were given to as to why in the 1400s the Portuguese kingdom set sail into the unknown was in search of Prester John. So that was very much, so there was not at the time, and for political reasons I later understood, there was never an effort to talk about a political rationale, to expand the control and the political power of the Kingdom of Portugal, nor was there ever an economic rationale. It was always Christianity. And there is an epic written by Luís de Camões called the Lusíadas. And in this epic, he centers he himself went in these ships in search of Prester John, and there were battles, and he lost an eye, and so this is very much part of what children, and I don't know, I've not been in part of the educational system in Portugal since I came to the United States some 40 years ago, so I don't know to what extent that is still the narrative, but this is what attracted me to your work. And I really want to laud you for it, because this kind of work is rare because it requires so many linguistic skills, and how difficult it must have been. Thank you very much for it. And I just wanted to add, so it was not necessarily a question, as just an expression of awe and gratitude.
Well, thank you. I mean, also I must stress here again that none of this would have happened. I'm an amateur in many languages, but what's the saying? I can make do, but in order to turn this into the shape that it is now, and in order to verify the sources, I talk to a lot of colleagues who really specialize in these languages. And I think that's the way to go forward, to work together, because otherwise it is impossible to tackle this kind of transcultural history, I think. But what we can, like coming back to Prester John on the Portuguese fascination with it, or with this myth, I mean, it is certainly in the sources, because at the moment that an Ethiopian ambassador is on his way to Lisbon, there's this effort to, there's the Portuguese king writes to the Pope and says, we are waiting for the Ethiopian ambassador to come, and we have finally found Prester John. Not quite, not quite. Other courts had found him before, and, this is actually 100 years late to the party, but the Portuguese are still running with this. We have finally found Prester John. And you notice it in the 16th century, and particularly also once the Jesuits get there, who are primarily Portuguese in the 16th and early 17th century, that they're, of course, being very snide in their reports of Ethiopia, which has also just seen a devastating local civil war, but they're being very snide because, of course, this real Christian kingdom cannot match up to the myth of Prester John, because there is just simply no kingdom on earth where there's milk and honey in the rivers and the riverbeds are made out of jewels. And so you see this in these Portuguese sources that get written then, where you get these very snide remarks about how this is actually a bit of a disappointment. But of course it needs to be, because, well, there is just no basis in reality for this myth, right? You're setting yourself up for disappointment. And this is also where, of course, the sources become far more ugly.
Do you remember who the king was, the King of Portugal, or the more or less the time period where this letter or this statement was made?
So this was sent in 1513. So is it Manuel?
Manuel, yes. He was most powerful. Yes, very well. Thank you. Thank you, and again for your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Verena. And you have a question from Monica Green. I don't know if Monica is going to turn on her video, but you can ask your question on audio. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'll just do it on audio. Thank you. And thank you for organizing this talk. As Verena knows, I've been following her work for quite some time. I think it's wonderful, and I think we should just state this explicitly, the importance of her presenting this work in a slavery archive context. And that is my impression as a medievalist, is that most of the discussion about any part of Africa in this period is historiographically, it's mostly in the context of slavery. And this is not at all a slavery story. And I was just wondering if Dr. Krebs could talk more about the ways her own understanding of the disconnect in historiographical thinking. And is this a way in which we need to stop talking about Africa, pretending that it's a country, and just be more insistent in talking about the different histories of different parts of Africa?
That's a good question. And once again, I can only possibly relate what I have encountered. And so something I come across very frequently is just the very leading question, namely, but how about slavery? And I'm like, in this particular, this plays no instance. There's, of course, there is slavery and there is slave trading from the Ethiopian highlands to other places. But this is not what the story in this case is about. And it doesn't, it really isn't at the heart of even, I think, the history of this kingdom at that time. I also tried getting another project off the ground that was once again a transcultural medieval project about gold and ivory. between Europe and Africa, because obviously, I mean, if you look at Europe, like if you look at the treasuries of European churches, they're full of things made of ivory and gold. And naturally, both resources are fairly scarce in Europe. You don't really have elephants roaming the Alps. So that material must have come actually from Africa. And a question that I tend to get is, but why not about slavery? And I'm like, well, this is not, why should it be? Why do we put this in there if this is going to be a research project about how this beautiful little diptych that is now in like a church in central Germany that was made from ivory in Aachen in Germany in the 12th century. And I want to know what were the ties? What was the connections between Aachen and wherever that elephant grew up? And how did this material travel? And I think that's a valid question to research in itself, without once again connecting it to slavery. And I think that's just a very leading, or leading, it's the wrong word, but it's a revealing reaction, I think, that people have, that they bring slavery into something that is not really related to it. Doesn't really answer your question again, I think.
Well, actually it does, in the sense that it just confirms that we have a historiographical problem, and you've really defined it for us. I hope this is a discussion that goes forward. And just again, want to thank the Slavery Archive for bringing your work into this discussion. Thank you both.
Okay, then Slavery Archive is indeed it's not a person, it's a hashtag. And I just want to clarify one dimension here in case you are just coming to this today. I've been using on social media then this hashtag Slavery Archive for almost for more than 5 years, to emphasize all then news and research associated with slavery, the Atlantic slave trade. And why this became a book club, it's because of the COVID-19. We had a number of scholars, young, older, men, women, Black, non-Black, Latinos, etc., who had new books being published. And we decided then to create this venue in order to showcase this scholarship that is indeed related to our own research interests. Then most of us co-hosting the book club, it's me, also Jessica Johnson from Hopkins, Vanessa Holden from the University of Kentucky, and Alex Hill from Columbia. Most of the books presented here are books associated then with the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, but we also had books on history of Africa that are not related to slavery in particular. It's the case of Verena's book. We also have, for example, a book coming that will be the last one this year by Ada Ferrer. That is a book on Cuba. Then it's not necessarily a book on slavery, but it became an umbrella to bring all these people who are doing this wonderful work and bring us together. Then and connect our research interests. Then it was never a question of bringing Verena's book to this discussion by insinuating that what she's doing is something related to slavery or the Atlantic slave trade. But we are happy to bring her because it's a way also for her work reach audiences who perhaps are not doing medieval history or are not Africanist historians and who will never know perhaps about her work. Do we have any other questions coming in the chat? Verena wants to say something. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying this, but also I think it's worth emphasizing that I mean, as you can hear from my accent, I am German and I now work in German academia again. And I found from my time of being a graduate student, because I work on or I define myself as a medievalist, but I work on the Horn of Africa, there's sort of like a falling through the cracks of discipline, because you're at one time, like you're in many fields, but at the same time not seen as belonging enough. So of course, I'm like just tremendously grateful to be able to present this work, because I like one of the big, like when I first started my PhD, this was something that one of my MA supervisors had told me, either people will see the relevance of this or they will just be confused, because you will not be either, you will be neither, right? And so I'm, of course, like also really happy to be able, I think, to present this work on the intersection of different disciplines or historical traditions that I might not necessarily have grown up in myself.
Thank you. Thank you, Verena. Do we have any more questions or any additional question? I have several. Then I will take my privilege. Who is, I have one?
Me, it's Vanessa.
Vanessa, you are there. Okay, go ahead.
So Verena, as you were speaking today about the book, you made the point about your, what I find delightful disinterest in how it is that Europeans are seeing Africans, but you're much more interested in viewpoints going the other direction. And so, you know, I know central to the work is about these diplomatic embassies and what exactly this exchange might signal to these kingdoms about their kings. But do you have a sense of what Ethiopian opinions are about these sovereign Christian kingdoms? I mean, it is sort of funny to hear how clearly Ethiopia is not some sort of like Shangri-La myth, and once Europeans finally managed to live long enough to go there and come back. But did Ethiopians have ideas about what these kingdoms might look like? Certainly Ethiopians had been in the Mediterranean world for a long time, so they had been to these other places. Did they have similar disappointments or impressions of these Western Latin kingdoms? Certainly the Western Latin kingdoms have high opinions of themselves, but I'm sort of interested. Maybe that's why none of these envoys ever made it back to Europe.
I mean, they were also like a good group of them was also detained at the Ethiopian royal court, and then eventually even made to paint for the Ethiopian elite. So they were basically painting hostages, which of course is quite smart because it's a security issue. Because if somebody trespasses into your dominion, I mean, you know, why not keep them? But I get the impression from the sources that I've come across that Latin Europe really stayed this very indistinct frank land. And there was comparatively little interest to really find out what that Frankland was about, because it was a place of strange Christianity. And I think in the book at one point I called the Pope like the leader of a Western schismatic group that whose ideas about how to be a good Christian would have sat very ill with the Ethiopian king of the time, who was himself a man of great religious learning. I think, and at the same time, I mean, the Kebre Nagast also says that already in the 6th century, the emperor of Byzantium and the Ethiopian king had met, and they had divided up the world between themselves, and the Ethiopian king got the lion's share. So, I mean, if you're arguing from that position, that Frankland out there is indistinct and weird, but you can still extract things that are beautiful and also, once again, signal your great reach from it. And you don't, I think also in one part of the book, I say, these embassies didn't even need to succeed. I think the very process of sending them out was already sending a message to the people that mattered, namely at home. And one last bit, so we get this beautiful account from the 1440s where like apparently it has become known in Ethiopia, in the Ethiopian highlands, to King Zara-Yacob, this king who rules for over 30 years and is this great man of ecclesiastical learning and also like a menace on the battlefield. But it has become known to him that people in Europe call him the Prester John. And he has it conveyed to others that he's not amused. He thinks that's a silly term, And his proper name is Zara Jacob, son of David, son of there's a whole genealogy, heir of the throne of David and Solomon. So that also tells you a bit about, like these people, they think I'm Prester John, this silly fiction, but I'm actually something better.
Yeah, and I think that this is a contribution, anecdotally to my own teaching when I'm teaching students, even about the Atlantic world, and I try to drive home the point that Africa is not one unified country somewhere, but that there are many different kingdoms with very well-known rulers. That this shifts the point of view, in thinking about, well, where is the seat of Christianity and Christian scholarship and development? And if the narrative is all about European discovery, again, I'm not sure how you're discovering things where other people live, but whatever. That this really does change the way of even covering the medieval world. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I don't know if we have more questions, but I would have a few questions about how did you get to this topic, Verena? Then I would like to know a little bit about your trajectory. I think that this would be useful for whoever is attending this session today. How did you get to this topic? And also for future students who would like to work on the history of Ethiopia, and during the period that you are looking at, or beyond or earlier, what would be, in your opinion, then aspects that are understudied, many certainly, but that would deserve to be studied for other future students on this topic? And if you want to comment also about the kinds of sources that you found, where you did research, in terms just of perhaps illuminating, then how did you get to do this kind of work that you are just seeing in its final format, that is the book, but you have been saying since the beginning that this is more than a decade of work.
Yeah, so as I said, I am German, so the German education system works a bit differently. So I was just, after a bachelor's, I decided to do a master's in history because I thought I might become a journalist. And I had the good fortune of being taught seminars on medieval history by somebody who was very unusual in German academe, namely a medievalist who specialized in Eastern Christianities and kept on offering seminars that was centered around the Eastern Mediterranean, the Holy Land. So from the very beginning, we were doing like histories of Jerusalem seen through the eyes of Syriac Orthodox Christians and Muslims and Jews in the Middle Ages. And so it was a very different view of a medieval world that I got as a student with this professor than if I had been possibly at a different university where it would have been the Carolingians ad nauseum, basically. So because these seminars were centered so much around basically the intersection of Afro-Eurasia, in this medieval world, of course, you had Ethiopian pilgrims to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, because Vanessa said earlier, they have had a presence in the Eastern Mediterranean for a very long time, and in Jerusalem for a long time. And so when I was looking for something to write a master's thesis on, and I wasn't at all sure about whether I would be an academe, I still thought I might become a journalist. I was like, well, I know nearly nothing about Ethiopia. That's fascinating. It's fascinating. I read Tadesse Tamrat's Church and State in Ethiopia, and that had a whole chapter on these embassies between Europe and Ethiopia. And I mean, I now criticize Tadesse Tamrat, and I still feel a pang of discomfort, because he was really, like, his work really just opened up a whole new world for me, because my reaction was like, how did I not know about this? How did I not know about these Ethiopian missions to Venice or even to Constance, where I was studying. So that's what I wrote my master's thesis about. And then eventually I very timidly asked that same professor whether she would maybe accept me as a PhD student, because that's how you do these things in Germany. But at the same time, I wanted to set up, if I were to do a PhD, I wanted to do something that is a possibility in German academia, that you can do a binational degree. So I went to Addis Ababa first, but then also to MacMillan University, which was one of the up and coming, very vibrant communities for historical research in Ethiopia in the early 2010s. And we set up a co-tutel binational PhD agreement. So I spent more or less half of my PhD in MacMillan as a PhD student and as a researcher and doing field work, because I was also interested in all of these beautiful objects that were mostly still located in Ethiopian churches and monasteries, because they're actually still in use to this day. Of course, I mean, there's a whole community of scholars, both in Ethiopia, but also beyond. So, for example, Hamburg here in Germany has this Center for Ethiopian Studies, which is mostly philology and languages and literature. But I see some of my colleagues and friends, participants here today, who, of course, were fantastic to link up with for me as a grad student, and then later as a postdoc, because I think really this is a team effort to be able to try to do justice to the sources that you come across.
Thank you so much, Verena. And this is really fascinating, and the possibility also, I think that is important, the dimension also that you emphasize, that the fact that you had experience also in Ethiopia. You are writing about the past, but you have that experience also about exploring then manuscripts and the material culture, and also being there for a while. And especially now, it's very important that we have this dimension as well. Do we have any additional questions? And I would like then to ask, you have, where is Alex?
Right, I kind of want to know what's next for you, Verena, after this book. So I haven't been working on a book for 10 years. I also have a hard time. What will I do after that?
Turns out my PhD thesis, which I completely put in the trash because I was not happy with it, although it did get an excellent mark, but eventually I wasn't happy with the findings because I struggled so much with the historiography, right? But the PhD, which was 220,000 words long, had a whole second part that looked at the material culture. And I thought, now that I've actually rewritten basically the first part of the PhD in a completely new book, why not also do something with the second part of what I did for my PhD? Because I think I now finally have a framework to make sense of these imported objects and the changes, dramatic, astounding changes in Ethiopian iconography and art of the time, which I think has a lot to do with how this kingdom that is always asserting its claim of Solomonic successorship is in the late 15th century and early 16th century suddenly ruled by many child kings. So you find from the 1470s onwards, that you have all of these child kings put on the throne by crown councils. And so the embassies then, go on the back burner. But what you do find is all of these royal women who are sitting in the crown councils actively importing and even commissioning works from places as far away as France. And I think that goes together with how we can, I think, at that point, look at the relationship between power and cultural efflorescence in a kingdom where all of a sudden, instead of having a king at the top, you have many nobles and especially royal women who also want to show, I think, by drawing on these same patterns that the kings did before them, that want to show their worldliness and reach by commissioning imports and whatnot. So the second book, if I ever get time to write it, because as junior faculty, it's not easy with the teaching and everything, but that would be really about how, like, a moment where ostensibly the kingly power is on the decline, we see the rise of, like, the cultural production of a whole kingdom, because there's more power to go around, and people basically outbidding one another with their own patronage.
Thank you.
Forward to it.
Yes. Now it's a lot of work, but we did the second book as well. Then I have a great interest in the topic. I am working on a more recent period, but all the issue of these embassies and the exchange of material culture is really something that I am looking forward to reading you, and I hope that you are applying for anything that is available here in the United States in order to find time to be released from teaching. Do we have more questions? No?
There's a final question in the chat.
I have a final question. Okay, please go, Elena. Ask your question.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much, Verena. That was a very interesting and excellent presentation and work. And I have to confess, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to getting my copy from Amazon even as we speak. And I really appreciate your work as an Ethiopianist. I enjoy the medieval period, the historical period as well. I just have one final question that came up when you're talking about your future project. And it's something I've been trying to deal with in my work as well. I work starting from pre-Aksumite period all the way to the 18th century, basically, in my work. And as an African woman and as an African scholar, things I've been seeing, like you've been unraveling about old scholarship, is that this taking away from Africans their innovation and craftsmanship. And I was wondering how in your future work, or you might have addressed this in your book as well, how you can make sure that readers know that there was an innovation and craftsmanship that is unique to the Ethiopian culture from the different time periods. And we see this again from the Italian early scholarship coming, that taking agency even for the pre-Aksumite period and giving it to South Arabians, for example. Africans could never build this kind of monument or architecture or craftsmanship. They must have hired someone from Yemen or Persia or the Roman Empire. So how do you balance this for people who don't have a background in Ethiopian history or African history? And we see this even for Great Zimbabwe, how when the first Europeans encountered Great Zimbabwe and said, this couldn't have been an African innovation, and so on. So I'm just pushing you to think about this, and I would love to hear your opinion on that. And thank you so much.
Thank you, and that's an important question, and I've been trying to tackle it head on, because in the last chapter of the book, for example, I start with the case of one of the Italian, in that case, actually one former colonial administrator, Enrico Cirulli, who writes about the ruins of an Ethiopian church of this time, or an Ethiopian royal church. And he says, well, this clearly, because it is such a beautiful, beautiful building, it must have been built by foreigners and it must have been built by Italians. And I say straight out in the book that I do not think that this has any merit and any basis whatsoever in the sources. And I emphasize greatly that all of these churches and all of these monasteries, for example, were born of the will of the ruler, and they had tremendous involvement in planning these churches and monasteries that had to be worthy of housing their grave, which is, of course, very important. So it doesn't really matter where the craftsmen come from, and I do not think that very many came from abroad. As I said, I think mainly this might have even been like even a ritual sending out of embassies to drive home the point locally that there was a reenactment of this Solomonic behavior. But I do not think that the background of the artisans really was fundamentally important to these buildings because they were born of the will of the ruler and of their patrons. And I think it is the same with the art being produced. Like if you hold an Italian merchant as a hostage at the royal court and you force him to paint, that is not an expression of Italian ingenuity and Renaissance craftsmanship and whatnot, which we have found in scholarship so far. So scholarship, especially for Ethiopian art of the period, is teeming with ideas about Italian masters and their Ethiopian pupils. And you see me make the air quotes. And I think this is once again a watered down holdover of colonialist thought, because who had the power here, as in most pre-modern societies, was of course the patrons, and whoever painted for them was realizing what they wanted as religious material culture to be donated, and as it is in the inscriptions often, to make sure that they were not forgotten after their death, right? So the agency is front and center here. And I think even if we do find quote unquote foreign influences, that in itself shows us that this is an environment where the elite, and that is an African Christian elite, was intentionally using these styles and iconographies for their own local agendas. So, and I think that inverses the power relationship, or I hope it does at least, because we get rid of notions of master painters changing the art of an empire and go to Ethiopian elite actually sort of engaging in a rivalry of like patronage that leads to things that have so far been completely unexplainable to us, because this culture was so much more global and had such a broad outlook that we have long struggled to even understand that.
Thank you, Verena. And I would just conclude then calling your attention, and I don't know if I will be able to show the book here again. Then this is the cover, but I think that because of my background, you cannot see very clear. Then Verena Krebs, Medieval Ethiopian Kingship, Craft and Diplomacy with Latin Europe, published in 2021 with Palgrave, MacMillan. And go ahead, get the book, ask your library to get the book as well. And now Alex is going to announce the next book club. And I would like to thank again, Verena, for this wonderful book and the presentation as well. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You are muted.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Verena. So I hope that you can join us on October 27th, which is Wednesday at 5 p.m. to discuss Wake, the hidden history of women-led slave revolts, which is our first graphic novel entry in the series, in the book club series. And this is done by Rebecca Hall, the scholar, and it was illustrated by Hugo Martins. So we hope that you can join us. It's a fascinating story, and it's one of these books that helps us reach a larger public than an academic public. So I hope you also invite students, friends to join us, and we hope to see you there.
Thank you so much, all. Have a good afternoon. Stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.